Just sign here, Mrs. Whitmore. The man in the gray suit pushed the papers closer, his pen hovering like a blade over the table. 78-year-old Eleanor Whitmore stared at the documents with trembling hands. If she signed them, the house her Marine husband built before leaving for Iraq would no longer be hers. Something about the man felt wrong. The way he rushed her, the way he wouldn't let her read. So Eleanor whispered a prayer under her breath. God, please send someone. Her hand lifted slightly, forming a silent signal for help she once saw on the news. Almost no one noticed. But across the diner, a Marine suddenly looked up, and his German Shepherd was already standing. Before we continue, comment where you're watching from, and don't forget to subscribe for more powerful stories like this. A pale autumn sun drifted over the pine-covered hills of Silver Falls, Montana, while a dry mountain wind whispered along the quiet highway, and the old roadside diner stood like a lonely refuge for travelers passing through. Inside the diner, the air smelled faintly of black coffee, fried potatoes, and decades of stories soaked into the wooden booths. The building itself was old but well kept. Checkered tiles on the floor, faded photographs of fishing tournaments and snowstorms hanging on the walls, and a long counter where locals usually gathered in the mornings. At this hour of the afternoon, however, the diner was unusually calm. Only 3 tables were occupied. A pair of truckers sat near the window speaking quietly. An elderly rancher read the local newspaper at the counter. And in the far booth near the wall sat a man whose presence carried a quiet gravity that did not belong to an ordinary traveler. Gunnery Sergeant Daniel Hayes was 43 years old, tall and broad-shouldered, with the solid frame of a man who had spent most of his adult life under discipline and hardship. His dark brown hair was cut short in the unmistakable military style, the sides closely trimmed while the top remained slightly longer. A faint streak of gray had begun to appear near his temples, not from age alone, but from years spent under the pressure of war zones where sleep was scarce and decisions were heavy. His jawline was sharp, framed by a short, neatly kept beard that gave his face a rugged seriousness. A thin scar ran diagonally across the edge of his left eyebrow, an old souvenir from an explosion outside Fallujah nearly 15 years earlier. Daniel rarely spoke about that day, but it had shaped him in ways even he could not always explain. His posture was upright even when sitting, the instinctive alertness of a Marine who had never fully learned how to relax. The camouflage jacket he wore was not formal uniform anymore, but a well-worn field coat that hinted at the life he had lived. Daniel Hayes was not a man who sought attention. In fact, since returning home from his last deployment, he had grown quieter with strangers, more thoughtful in silence. Yet beneath that calm exterior remained a reflex every Marine understood, the instinct to notice things others overlooked. Lying calmly beneath the table beside him was Ranger, a 5-year-old German Shepherd, whose powerful frame and rich amber-brown fur immediately revealed he was no ordinary pet. Ranger weighed nearly 80 pounds, with a thick coat that darkened into black along his back and shoulders, forming the classic saddle pattern of his breed. His ears were tall and sharply angled, constantly adjusting to sounds around him even when he appeared to be resting. Ranger had served 2 tours as a canine working dog with a Marine security unit overseas. Though he now lived as Daniel's companion rather than an active military dog, the training and his instincts had never faded. At the moment, Ranger lay quietly with his head resting between his front paws, appearing relaxed to anyone who glanced his way. Daniel sat above him, sipping slowly from a ceramic mug of black coffee, letting the warmth spread through his hands. The road had been long that morning. He had been driving south for hours along the mountain highway, unsure exactly where he planned to stop for the night. Sometimes the road itself felt easier than staying still. For a while, nothing happened. Then Ranger lifted his head. The movement was subtle but deliberate. His ears rose straight upward, and his gaze shifted across the diner toward the far corner booth. Daniel noticed it instantly. Over the years, he had learned to trust Ranger's instincts even before his own. "What is it, buddy?" Daniel murmured quietly, glancing down. Ranger did not bark. He did not move from his position, but his eyes remained locked on something across the room. Daniel followed the direction of the dog's stare. At the booth near the back wall sat an elderly woman and a man in a gray suit. At first glance, the scene appeared ordinary enough. A simple conversation over paperwork. But the longer Daniel watched, the more something about the moment began to feel wrong. The elderly woman was Eleanor Whitmore, 78 years old. Though time had carved deeper lines across her face than her age alone might suggest. She was small and slender, her posture slightly stooped, as if the weight of years had gradually pressed her shoulders downward. Her hair, once perhaps a soft brown, had turned completely silver and was gathered neatly into a loose bun at the back of her head. A few fragile strands escaped around her temples. Her skin was pale and thin with age, marked by gentle wrinkles that framed kind blue eyes, now clouded with uncertainty. Eleanor wore a modest beige cardigan over a light floral blouse, clothing that spoke of practicality rather than fashion. Her hands trembled faintly as she held a pen above several pages spread across the table. There was something fragile about her presence, not weakness exactly, but the quiet vulnerability of someone who had spent too many evenings alone in a house that once held more life. Across from her sat Calvin Rhodes, a man perhaps in his mid-40s whose polished appearance contrasted sharply with the humble atmosphere of the diner. Calvin was tall and lean, with neatly styled dark hair brushed back from a high forehead. His face was clean-shaven, smooth in the careful way of someone who paid close attention to his presentation. He wore a tailored gray suit and a navy tie, clothing that looked out of place in a roadside diner where most customers arrived in work boots or flannel jackets. But what Daniel noticed most about Calvin Rhodes was not his clothing. It was his smile. The smile never quite reached his eyes. His voice carried easily across the quiet diner as he spoke in a tone of rehearsed patience. "Just sign right here, Mrs. Whitmore. That's all we need to finalize everything." He tapped one of the pages with a pen. Eleanor hesitated. "Well, I suppose I should read it again," she murmured softly. Calvin chuckled lightly, leaning forward in his seat. "There's no need to worry about that. These are standard documents. We've already gone over them before, remember?" He slid the papers slightly closer to her. Daniel felt Ranger's body tense beneath the table. Eleanor Whitmore's hand trembled as she lowered the pen toward the paper. Calvin watched her carefully, the patience in his expression thinning just enough to reveal a hint of irritation beneath. "Right there," he said again. Then something small happened. So small that anyone else in the diner might have missed it completely. As Calvin glanced down to shuffle the pages into a straighter stack, Eleanor's hand lifted from the table for just a moment. 3 fingers curled inward toward her palm, while her thumb folded across them. Then her hand closed gently into a fist. Daniel's breath slowed. He had seen that gesture before. Not in person, but on a training video years ago during a briefing about civilian distress signals. A silent SOS. Across the room, Ranger's ears remained upright, his eyes unwavering. Daniel leaned back slightly in his booth, watching the pair more carefully now. His mind replayed the movement he had just seen, comparing it against memory. The gesture had been subtle, uncertain, but unmistakable. Calvin Rhodes pushed the papers closer once more. "Go ahead," he said quietly. Eleanor Whitmore's hand trembled again. For a brief second, her gaze lifted from the paperwork and drifted across the diner. Her eyes passed over the truckers near the window, the rancher at the counter, and finally stopped on Daniel Hayes. There was something in that look: fear, hope, and a silent question. Under the table, Ranger slowly rose to his feet. Daniel felt it instantly, and in that quiet diner in Silver Falls, the Marine understood something with absolute certainty. Something here was very wrong. And Ranger had noticed it first. Daniel Hayes did not move immediately after recognizing the signal. Years of training had taught him that rushing into a situation without understanding it could make things worse. Instead, he remained seated in his booth, appearing calm while his eyes quietly studied the corner table across the diner. Ranger stood beneath the table now, no longer lying down, his body still but alert, his amber eyes fixed on the two figures near the back wall. Daniel slowly lifted his coffee mug to his lips, though he was no longer thinking about the drink. His attention was focused entirely on the interaction unfolding several yards away. Calvin Rhodes leaned forward across the table again. Up close, the man's expression revealed more than his carefully rehearsed politeness. Beneath the polished smile was impatience. His eyes were narrow, calculating, the kind of eyes that measured opportunity rather than people. The sleeves of his tailored gray suit were perfectly pressed, and a gold watch gleamed faintly beneath the cuff of his left wrist. Everything about Calvin's appearance suggested confidence and control. Yet there was also something practiced about him, as though every word he spoke had been repeated in similar conversations before. "Mrs. Whitmore," Calvin said smoothly, tapping the pen against the paper again. "We've already discussed all of this. Signing now simply confirms what we agreed on. It protects your property and prevents complications with the county later. These legal matters can become messy if they're delayed."
Eleanor Whitmore sat quietly, her shoulders drawn inward. The fluorescent lights above the booth cast soft shadows across the delicate lines of her face.
She held the pen carefully between thin fingers that trembled with uncertainty. Though her voice was gentle by nature, something inside her seemed locked in silent resistance. She looked down at the pages, but did not sign. "I just thought I should read it once more," she said softly. "I'm not very quick with these things." Calvin's smile remained, but the corners of it tightened slightly. "Of course," he replied, though the patience in his tone sounded thinner than before. "But I assure you, there's nothing unusual here. It's routine paperwork." Under the table beside Daniel, Ranger's throat released a low rumble. It was barely audible, more vibration than sound, but Daniel felt it immediately. The dog's instincts had shifted from curiosity to caution. Ranger's body remained perfectly still, yet his ears had angled forward and his muscles had grown tense beneath his thick fur. Daniel set his coffee mug down slowly. The signal Eleanor had given earlier replayed in his mind again. It was not a gesture someone made casually. He had learned about it years ago during a briefing about civilian distress signals used by victims who could not speak openly. He waited a moment longer. Then Daniel pushed himself to his feet. His movements were calm and unhurried, the controlled stride of someone accustomed to carrying authority without announcing it. The wooden floor creaked faintly beneath his boots as he walked across the diner. Ranger followed one step behind him, silent and watchful. A few of the other customers glanced up briefly as Daniel passed, though none of them seemed to understand the tension building beneath the quiet afternoon atmosphere. When Daniel reached the booth, he stopped beside the table rather than sitting immediately. From this distance, he could see the papers clearly. Several pages were stacked together, dense with small printed text and signature lines. Calvin looked up, surprised by the interruption. "Yes?" Calvin asked. Daniel's voice was steady and calm. "Ma'am, everything all right here?" Eleanor Whitmore looked up at him. For a moment she seemed uncertain whether she should answer. Her eyes moved briefly toward Calvin before returning to Daniel's face. In that instant, Daniel saw something unmistakable in her expression. Fear held tightly behind politeness. Calvin spoke before she could respond. "Everything is perfectly fine," he said smoothly, leaning back slightly in his seat. "Private legal business, nothing to worry about." Daniel nodded slowly, as if considering the explanation. He did not move away. Instead, he placed one hand lightly on the edge of the booth seat. Ranger stood beside his leg, watching Calvin without blinking. Calvin noticed the dog now and gave a small laugh. "Nice shepherd," he said casually. "Very disciplined." Daniel gave a faint nod. "He's had good training." For a moment no one spoke. The quiet hum of the diner returned, the distant clink of dishes from the kitchen, the low murmur of conversation from the truckers near the window. Then Daniel looked back at Eleanor. "Ma'am," he said again gently, "do you need help?" Eleanor's hand trembled slightly on the table. For several seconds she did nothing. Then, slowly, her fingers lifted again. 3 fingers curled inward toward her palm. Her thumb crossed over them. The hand closed into a fist. The signal was unmistakable. Daniel's eyes hardened slightly, though his face remained calm. Across the table, Calvin Rhodes had been watching carefully. Something in Daniel's posture had changed, and Calvin sensed it immediately. His expression shifted from polite patience to guarded irritation. "I think we're finished here," Calvin said suddenly, gathering the papers together. "Mrs. Whitmore has important matters to attend to, and interruptions aren't helping." Daniel's gaze moved from Eleanor back to Calvin. "Mind if I take a look at the paperwork?" he asked quietly. Calvin laughed lightly, though the sound carried an edge. "Actually, yes, I do mind. These are confidential documents." Ranger stepped slightly forward. The German shepherd's large frame was imposing up close, and his eyes remained fixed on Calvin with quiet intensity. Ranger did not bark. He did not growl again. But there was something in the dog's posture that made Calvin's smile fade for a moment. Daniel pulled out the empty seat beside Eleanor and sat down calmly. His movements were deliberate but unthreatening, as if he had every right to be there. "Ma'am," he said softly, "you don't have to sign anything until you're comfortable." Eleanor swallowed and nodded faintly. Calvin's jaw tightened. The control he had maintained throughout the conversation was slipping. "Look," Calvin said sharply now, "I don't know who you are, but this conversation doesn't concern you." Daniel met his gaze evenly. "My name's Daniel Hayes," he replied, "and I'm just making sure she's all right." Across the diner, the rancher at the counter lowered his newspaper slightly, sensing tension in the room. The truckers by the window had stopped talking. Even the waitress near the kitchen door had paused to watch. Calvin gathered the papers again, sliding them toward himself. "Mrs. Whitmore," he said quickly, "we should finish this elsewhere." But Eleanor did not move. Instead, she looked directly at Daniel, and for the first time since the conversation began, her voice carried quiet determination. I think I would like someone else to read these first." Calvin Rhodes stared at her. The calm confidence he had worn like a mask began to crack. Under the table, Ranger's ears lifted higher, sensing the shift in tension. Daniel reached slowly toward the stack of documents, and the moment his fingers touched the first page, he already knew something about the situation was about to become very serious. Daniel Hayes turned the first page slowly, careful not to rush, even though his instincts were already shouting at him that something was wrong. Years of military training had conditioned him to absorb details quickly under pressure, but he had also learned the value of patience. Acting too fast could escalate a situation unnecessarily. So he forced himself to read carefully, letting his eyes travel across the dense lines of legal language, printed in small, tightly packed paragraphs. Ranger stood beside his chair now, the large German shepherd's body forming a quiet wall between Daniel and Calvin Rhodes. His thick, amber-brown fur caught the diner's fluorescent light, while his sharp ears remained upright. Ranger did not bark, but the focus in his gaze was unmistakable. He was watching Calvin with the same intensity he once reserved for suspicious movements during patrols overseas. Daniel flipped another page. The wording became clearer with each line. Property transfer. Primary residence. Asset authorization. His jaw tightened slightly. Across the table, Eleanor Whitmore sat with her hands folded together now, as if she had withdrawn from the decision entirely. Up close, the delicate tremor in her fingers was more visible than before. Her pale blue eyes moved between Daniel and Calvin, uncertain what might happen next. Eleanor had spent most of her life in this small Montana town. People like her believed paperwork and polite voices were signs of trustworthiness. The realization that she had nearly signed away everything she owned had begun to settle slowly in her chest, like cold water. Calvin Rhodes shifted in his seat. He had been watching Daniel read, and the confident smile he wore earlier was beginning to fade. Up close, small details in Calvin's appearance revealed the man behind the polished exterior. The gray suit was expensive, but slightly too sharp for a rural diner, as though it had been chosen carefully to project authority. His dark hair was styled with deliberate precision, and his clean-shaven jawline gave him a professional appearance. But beneath the smooth presentation, there was tension in his shoulders now. Calvin was the kind of man who relied on control in conversations. When someone disrupted that control, his patience rarely lasted long. "Those documents are confidential," Calvin said finally, his voice sharper now. "You really shouldn't be reading them." Daniel didn't look up. Instead, he turned the final page. The last paragraph confirmed everything. When he lifted his eyes again, the calm in his expression had hardened into something far more direct. "Ma'am," Daniel said quietly to Eleanor, "did he tell you this transfers ownership of your house?" Eleanor blinked. "My house?" she repeated faintly. Daniel slid the paper slightly toward her so she could see the highlighted line. "And every financial account listed under your name," he added. For a moment, the diner seemed completely silent. Eleanor Whitmore stared down at the document. Her breath caught in her throat. The realization struck slowly but heavily. "That can't be right," she whispered. Calvin pushed back his chair suddenly. "That's enough," he said, standing up. The calm professional tone had disappeared from his voice entirely now. His movements were quick and defensive, the behavior of someone who had just lost control of a carefully managed situation. "You're misinterpreting the paperwork," he continued. "It's standard asset protection language." Daniel stood as well, though his movements remained controlled. "Funny," Daniel said calmly, tapping the page, "because it reads exactly like a property transfer." Calvin's eyes flicked toward the diner door. That single glance was enough. Ranger noticed it immediately. The German shepherd stepped forward with a sudden burst of energy, positioning himself directly between Calvin Rhodes and the exit. His body was large and powerful, his posture alert. This time the low growl that rolled from his chest was unmistakable. The truckers at the window turned in their seats. The rancher at the counter lowered his newspaper completely. Even the waitress standing near the kitchen doorway had frozen in place. The waitress's name was Linda Parker, a woman in her early 50s who had worked at the Silver Falls Diner for more than 2 decades. Linda was tall and sturdy, with sun-worn skin and short, sandy blonde hair that curled slightly around her ears. Years of balancing trays and moving through crowded lunch hours had given her a confident stride and a sharp awareness of trouble when it appeared. She had seen arguments before in the diner, but the tension in the room now was something different. Calvin tried to step around the dog. Ranger moved again. The shepherd's deep bark exploded through the diner, echoing off the walls. Calvin froze. "Call the police," Linda said firmly from behind the counter. One of the truckers had already pulled out his phone. Daniel did not move closer to Calvin. He simply stood beside the booth, watching him calmly. "You should sit down," Daniel said. Calvin's composure finally broke. "This is ridiculous!" he snapped. "You can't just accuse someone of fraud because you don't understand legal documents." But even as he spoke, his eyes kept drifting toward the door. Outside, the highway wind rattled softly against the diner windows. The seconds stretched. Then faintly, in the distance, the sound of approaching sirens began to rise. Calvin's shoulders tensed. For a brief moment, he seemed to consider running anyway. But Ranger stepped forward again, teeth bared slightly now, the powerful shepherd clearly ready to move if Calvin tried anything foolish. The sirens grew louder. 2 minutes later, the diner door swung open. Deputy Mark Alvarez entered first. Alvarez was a broad man in his mid-30s with olive-toned skin and thick black hair cut short beneath his sheriff's cap. His square jaw carried the beginnings of dark stubble from a long shift. Mark Alvarez had grown up in Silver Falls and had joined the county sheriff's department 10 years earlier after serving a short tour with the National Guard. He was known around town as someone calm under pressure, though people who knew him well understood that he could become extremely serious when someone threatened the safety of local residents. Behind him followed Deputy Claire Bennett, a younger officer in her late 20s. Claire was tall and athletic, with dark auburn hair pulled tightly into a ponytail beneath her patrol cap. Her sharp green eyes scanned the room quickly the moment she stepped inside. Claire had transferred to the Silver Falls Department only a year earlier from Billings, bringing with her a reputation for careful investigative work. Deputy Alvarez took in the scene quickly. The frightened elderly woman, the tense man in the gray suit, the Marine standing beside the booth, and the German shepherd guarding the exit. "What's going on here?" Alvarez asked. Daniel nodded toward the papers on the table. "You might want to read those." Claire Bennett stepped forward and lifted the top page. It took her less than 10 seconds. She looked up at Calvin Rhodes. "You're going to want to keep your hands where I can see them," she said. The handcuffs clicked shut around Calvin's wrists less than a minute later. As the deputies escorted him toward the door, Ranger relaxed slightly and stepped back to Daniel's side. Eleanor Whitmore remained seated, still staring at the documents on the table. The danger had passed, but the shock of how close she had come to losing everything had only just begun to settle in. The tension inside the diner slowly faded after the patrol car carrying Calvin Rhodes disappeared down the quiet highway. The flashing lights that had painted the windows red and blue only minutes earlier were gone now, leaving the afternoon sunlight to settle gently across the worn wooden booths again. The other customers gradually returned to their seats, their conversations beginning cautiously at first, then rising back into the ordinary hum of a small-town diner where dramatic moments were rare. Daniel Hayes remained seated at the booth with Eleanor Whitmore, the stack of fraudulent papers now resting safely in the hands of Deputy Claire Bennett, who had stepped outside with Deputy Mark Alvarez to finish processing the arrest. Ranger had settled down beside Daniel's chair again, though his alert posture had softened slightly. The large German shepherd's amber eyes still scanned the room occasionally, but the tension that had stiffened his muscles earlier had eased. Eleanor Whitmore sat quietly across from Daniel, her thin hands wrapped around a mug of tea that Linda Parker had placed in front of her moments earlier. Linda, the longtime waitress of the Silver Falls diner, had returned to the counter, but continued glancing over with a protective expression that suggested she was keeping watch, just in case the elderly woman needed anything else. Eleanor's shoulders trembled faintly, though not from fear anymore. The emotional weight of what had almost happened was finally settling in. Her pale blue eyes carried the distant look of someone replaying events in her mind, trying to understand how close she had come to losing everything she owned. Daniel did not rush the silence. He had learned long ago that people often needed time before they could explain something painful. Instead, he leaned back slightly in his seat, his broad shoulders relaxed but attentive. Ranger rested his chin briefly on Daniel's knee, as if sensing that the moment no longer required vigilance, but quiet presence instead. The dog was nearly 5 years old now, his strong frame still in the prime of his life. His thick coat carried the deep black saddle across his back that contrasted with the rich amber fur along his neck and legs. Ranger had spent much of his early life in structured training environments, where obedience and detection were second nature. Even now, living a quieter civilian life with Daniel, the shepherd carried himself with the disciplined patience of a soldier who never fully forgot his purpose. Eleanor finally spoke after several moments. "I'm terribly sorry you had to get involved in all that," she said softly, her voice gentle but tired. "I didn't mean to cause trouble for anyone." Daniel shook his head slightly. "You didn't cause trouble," he replied calmly. "You asked for help." The elderly woman looked down at the tea in her hands. "I almost signed those papers," she admitted quietly. "If you hadn't walked over." Her voice trailed off. Daniel studied her face carefully now. Up close, the years had left delicate lines around her eyes and mouth, the kind that often belonged to someone who had spent a lifetime caring for others rather than themselves. There was kindness in Eleanor Whitmore's expression, but also loneliness, the kind of loneliness that made people more vulnerable to those who pretended to offer assistance. "How did he find you?" Daniel asked gently. Eleanor took a slow breath before answering. 3 weeks ago," she began. "Mr. Rhodes knocked on my door one afternoon. He said he worked with a financial advisory group that helped older homeowners protect their properties from tax complications. I didn't think much of it at the time. He seemed polite, very professional." Daniel listened without interrupting. "He came back 2 days later," she continued, "brought brochures and documents, explained things in ways that sounded convincing. I suppose I should have asked someone else about it, but I don't really have anyone nearby anymore." The words carried a quiet sadness. "I live alone now," she added. Daniel nodded slowly. "Your husband?" he asked. Eleanor's eyes softened slightly at the question. "He passed away 11 years ago," she said. For a moment her expression changed, the distant look returning to her gaze as if she were staring through time rather than at the table in front of her. "My husband built our house himself," she continued after a moment, "just outside town, near the ridge where the pine trees start. He spent 2 summers working on it before it was finished." Daniel imagined the place immediately. Silver Falls was surrounded by those hills. Small homes built by hand were common along the edges of the forest. "What was his name?" Daniel asked. "Thomas," Eleanor replied quietly. "Thomas Whitmore." Ranger lifted his head slightly when she spoke, though he quickly settled again. The diner's afternoon light filtered through the window beside the booth, casting long golden lines across the table. Eleanor glanced at Daniel's jacket now. The faint outline of his Marine Corps insignia was still visible along the worn fabric. Her eyes narrowed slightly with curiosity. "Were you in the Marines?" she asked. Daniel nodded once. "Yes, ma'am." Eleanor studied him carefully for a moment, as though confirming something she had suspected since he first walked across the diner. My husband was a Marine too, she said quietly. Daniel did not speak immediately. Eleanor continued, her voice softer now. Captain Thomas Whitmore, 3rd Marine Division. Daniel's posture shifted slightly. The Marines were a brotherhood that stretched across generations. Hearing the name of another Marine always carried weight, especially when the story behind it was not yet known. Vietnam? Daniel asked gently. Eleanor shook her head. No, she said. Iraq. Daniel's eyes remained steady, though something in his expression deepened. He was stationed in Fallujah, Eleanor continued. 2nd deployment. He was 42 years old. The quiet in the diner seemed heavier now. Eleanor stared at the table for a long moment before speaking again. The house Calvin tried to take from me today, she said slowly. That's the house Thomas built before he left for that deployment. Daniel felt Ranger's head press gently against his leg again. The German shepherd had not moved much throughout the conversation, but his calm presence seemed to comfort Eleanor in ways words could not. I didn't realize what those papers meant at first, Eleanor said softly. But when he kept pushing me to sign without reading, something inside me told me it wasn't right. She looked at Daniel again. That's when I remembered the signal I'd seen on television last year. Daniel nodded. You did exactly the right thing. Eleanor Whitmore exhaled slowly. For the first time since the incident, the tension in her shoulders seemed to ease completely. Across the diner, Linda Parker quietly refilled coffee mugs at the counter, pretending not to listen while clearly following every word of the conversation. Outside, the wind moved through the pine trees along the edge of the highway. The danger had passed. But the story behind Eleanor Whitmore was only just beginning to reveal itself. The late afternoon light had softened into a pale golden glow by the time Daniel Hayes and Eleanor Whitmore finished their conversation in the quiet diner. Outside the wide windows, the sky above Silver Falls had begun its slow transition toward evening, the pine-covered hills turning darker shades of green as the sun dipped lower behind them. The small town seemed calm again, the brief tension of the afternoon fading into something almost unreal, like a storm that had passed quickly, but left the air still trembling afterward. Daniel sat quietly across from Eleanor, his large hands resting loosely on the table. He had not spoken for several moments after hearing the story of Captain Thomas Whitmore. There were some things Marines did not need to explain to each other. Even across generations, the weight of service and loss carried a language of its own. Ranger lay beside Daniel's chair now, his powerful body relaxed but attentive, the tip of his tail resting gently against the diner floor. When Eleanor's trembling hand lowered to the table again, Ranger slowly lifted his head and nudged her fingers with the top of his muzzle. The large German shepherd's warm breath brushed against her skin as he rested his head briefly against her hand. Eleanor smiled faintly. Thank you, she murmured, softly stroking the thick fur behind Ranger's ears. You're a very good dog. Ranger's eyes closed halfway, as if acknowledging the praise. Daniel watched the moment quietly. The dog had always been sensitive to human emotion. Ranger had once been trained to detect explosives and track movement across hostile terrain. Yet in quieter moments, he often seemed to understand human distress just as easily. Outside the diner door, the patrol car belonging to Deputy Mark Alvarez remained parked along the shoulder of the highway. Deputy Claire Bennett had finished logging the documents Calvin Rhodes had brought with him, sealing them inside an evidence envelope before returning them to the patrol vehicle. A few minutes later, the two deputies re-entered the diner briefly to check on Eleanor before leaving town to process the arrest at the county station. Deputy Alvarez approached the booth again, removing his cap as he spoke. Mrs. Whitmore, he said in his steady, respectful tone. We'll be contacting the county attorney's office about the documents he brought. It looks like this man has attempted similar scams in other towns. Eleanor nodded slowly. Will he come back? She asked quietly. Alvarez shook his head. Not any time soon. His dark eyes shifted briefly toward Daniel. Good thing you noticed what was going on, he added. Daniel simply shrugged. Ranger's ears flicked upward slightly as the deputy spoke, though the dog remained calm. Once the officers left again, the diner slowly returned to its normal rhythm. Linda Parker wiped down the counter with a towel while occasionally glancing toward Eleanor with quiet concern. Outside, a pickup truck rumbled down the highway, its engine fading quickly into the distance. Daniel stood slowly. You live nearby? He asked Eleanor. Yes, she replied. Just outside town, near the Ridge Road. Daniel nodded. I can walk you to your car. Eleanor hesitated for a moment before accepting. Thank you. They stepped outside together into the cool mountain air. The wind carried the scent of pine trees and distant wood smoke from houses along the hillside. Eleanor's car, a small silver sedan that had clearly seen many winters, was parked near the edge of the gravel lot. Daniel waited as she unlocked the door. Before she climbed inside, Eleanor turned toward him again. You reminded me of my husband today, she said gently. Daniel met her gaze. He would have done the same thing. Daniel didn't answer immediately. Instead, he simply gave a small nod. Ranger stood beside him, watching Eleanor quietly as she started the car and drove slowly down the highway toward the outskirts of Silver Falls. For a long moment, Daniel remained in the parking lot, his eyes following the fading shape of the car as it disappeared between the pine trees. Then he exhaled slowly. Come on, Ranger, he said. The German Shepherd rose immediately, falling into step beside him as they returned to the diner. 3 days later, the story had spread across nearly every corner of Silver Falls. Small towns had a way of carrying news faster than any newspaper ever could. By the weekend, nearly everyone who stopped by the diner had heard about the man who tried to steal an old widow's home, and the Marine and his dog who stopped him. Some people exaggerated the story as they told it. Others simply shook Daniel's hand when they saw him in town. Daniel handled the attention the same way he handled most things, with quiet modesty. That Saturday morning, the diner was busier than usual. Several locals had gathered for breakfast, and Linda Parker moved quickly between tables, carrying plates of eggs and coffee mugs. Near the window sat a tall man with broad shoulders and weathered skin darkened by years working outdoors. His name was Walter Green, a 60-year-old rancher who owned several acres of land outside Silver Falls. Walter had a thick gray beard and calm brown eyes that gave him the appearance of someone who had spent most of his life observing the world rather than arguing with it. Walter leaned back in his chair as Daniel walked in. That your dog? He asked. Daniel nodded. Name's Ranger. Walter studied the German Shepherd with quiet appreciation. Good animal, he said. Ranger's ears twitched slightly at the compliment. Later that morning, a reporter from the Silver Falls Gazette arrived as well. Her name was Emily Carter, a woman in her early 30s, with short auburn hair and curious hazel eyes that seemed constantly alert for a story. Emily carried a small notebook and camera bag, her posture energetic with the excitement of covering what might be the most unusual event the town had seen in months. She approached Daniel carefully. Mr. Hayes? She asked. Daniel glanced up from his coffee. Emily offered a polite smile. I heard you helped stop a fraud attempt earlier this week. Daniel sighed softly. It wasn't much. Emily glanced at Ranger. People are calling you and your dog heroes. Daniel looked out the window toward the quiet highway. After a moment, he answered simply, Marines look after their own. Emily paused, scribbling the sentence into her notebook. Later that afternoon, as the diner quieted again, Daniel stood outside with Ranger beside him. The wind moved through the pine trees along the ridge road where Eleanor Whitmore's house stood somewhere beyond the hills. Sometimes the smallest moments carried the greatest weight. A signal, a dog's instinct, a Marine who happened to be in the right place at the right time. And somewhere beyond the ridge, in a small house built by a Marine who never returned home, a widow still had a place to live. Sometimes miracles don't arrive with thunder or bright light. Sometimes they arrive quietly, in the form of a stranger who chooses to help, a loyal dog who senses danger, or a moment when someone notices a silent cry for help. Perhaps God places people in the right place at the right moment, not by accident, but by purpose. A small act of courage can become the miracle someone else has been praying for. In our everyday lives, we may pass hundreds of people without knowing the battles they are fighting. A kind word, a watchful eye, or a helping hand might change the course of someone's life more than we ever realize. If this story touched your heart, share where you're watching from in the comments. Your voice and your story matter here. Don't forget to like this video, share it with someone who might need a little hope today, and subscribe to the channel for more stories of courage, kindness, and faith. May God bless you and your family, protect your path, and surround your life with people who watch over you when you need it most.